Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 1. The morning mist drifted slowly across the coastal hills. Ethan followed the narrow stone path that wound gently toward the sea. The air had changed. It carried the fresh scent of salt and seagrass. Somewhere beyond the white cliffs, waves rolled steadily against the shore. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. He smiled. Long before he could see the ocean, he could already hear its quiet heartbeat. The road gradually climbed higher. Wildflowers became fewer. In their place grew small white daisies and sturdy grasses that danced fearlessly in the sea breeze. Seagulls circled overhead. Their distant calls echoed across the cliffs. For the first time in many days, the world felt wonderfully wide. Ethan paused beside a weathered wooden sign. Its faded letters read, "To the lighthouse, 1 mile." Below it, someone had carved a smaller message. "When the path disappears, follow the light." He gently traced the words with his fingertips. A soft smile crossed his face. It sounded like another lesson waiting to be discovered. He continued walking. The cliffs rose higher with every step. Far below, waves crashed gently against ancient rocks. Foamy white water shimmered beneath the morning sun. At last, the mist slowly parted. There it stood, a tall white lighthouse upon the edge of the cliffs. Its weathered stone walls had faced countless storms. Its lantern room shone brightly beneath the clear blue sky. Though it was morning, its light still turned slowly across the sea, not because darkness remained, but because someone believed guidance should never depend on the time of day. Ethan stood quietly. There was something comforting about its steady rhythm. Round and round, never rushing, never stopping. As he approached, he noticed a small stone cottage resting beside the lighthouse. Its garden overflowed with lavender, rosemary, and white roses. A narrow path of smooth seashells led to a bright blue wooden door. Wind chimes made from polished sea glass sang softly in the breeze. Chime, chime, chime. Before Ethan could knock, the door slowly opened. An elderly man stepped outside. His silver hair moved gently in the sea wind. He wore a navy blue sweater beneath a weathered brown coat. His eyes were calm, bright, and remarkably kind. He smiled as though he had been expecting Ethan all morning. "Welcome." His voice was warm and steady. "I was beginning to wonder when the wind would bring you." Ethan smiled politely. "My name is Ethan." The old man nodded. "I know." That surprised him. "You do?" The man laughed softly. "Travelers usually arrive carrying questions. You," he looked kindly at Ethan's backpack, "arrived carrying answers." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The lighthouse lantern continued its slow, graceful turn above them. Finally, the old man extended his hand. "My name is Elias. I've been the lighthouse keeper for nearly 40 years. Ethan shook his hand. "It must be lonely here." Elias looked toward the endless sea. A peaceful smile touched his face. "Only if you believe silence means being alone." A cool breeze swept across the cliffs. The wind chimes answered with another gentle melody. Ethan suddenly remembered Samuel's words in the cedar forest. Listen deeply. Perhaps every place along his journey had been preparing him for this one. Elias picked up an old brass lantern resting beside the doorway. "Come." The sea has a habit of telling its stories before breakfast. Together they began walking toward the winding staircase that circled the lighthouse. Above them, the great beacon continued to shine, patiently, faithfully, waiting for every traveler who had not yet found the courage to believe there was still light beyond the fog. Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 2. The stone staircase wrapped gently around the outside of the lighthouse. Each step had been worn smooth by countless years of wind, rain, and faithful footsteps. Elias climbed slowly, not because age had weakened him, but because he seemed to believe every step deserved to be noticed. Ethan followed quietly. Below them, the sea stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The waves rolled in steady rhythm. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The salty breeze carried tiny drops of mist through the air. Seagulls drifted gracefully above the cliffs, their white wings glowing beneath the morning sun. About halfway up the staircase, Elias stopped beside a small wooden bench built into the stone wall. He rested the brass lantern beside him. "Sit for a moment." Ethan did. The view was breathtaking. The ocean shimmered like polished glass where the sunlight touched it. Far in the distance, a tiny fishing boat floated peacefully upon the calm water. "It's beautiful," Ethan whispered. Elias smiled. "It is. But beauty isn't why I stop here every morning." Ethan looked at him curiously. "Then why?" The old lighthouse keeper pointed toward the horizon. "Because every morning, I remind myself that no matter how far I can see, there is always more beyond it." Ethan followed his gaze. The line where the sea met the sky seemed endless. It made him realize how small he was, yet strangely, how connected he felt to everything around him. After a few quiet moments, Elias picked up the lantern again. "Come, there's someone I'd like you to meet." They continued climbing until they reached a narrow balcony just below the lantern room. There, sitting comfortably in the sunlight, was a large white and gray seabird. Its feathers shimmered softly in the breeze. One of its wings carried a faint old scar. The bird looked toward Elias and gave a gentle call. "Krog." Elias smiled warmly. "Good morning, Captain." The bird hopped closer without fear. Ethan laughed softly. "You named him Captain?" Elias nodded. "He earned it. Years ago, during a violent storm, the injured seabird had landed on the lighthouse balcony. Its wing had been badly hurt. For weeks, Elias cared for it. He expected the bird to leave once it had healed. Instead, Captain chose to stay. Every sunrise, Elias said, he flies out across the sea. And every sunset, he comes home. Ethan gently reached out his hand. Captain studied him for a moment, then calmly stepped closer and allowed Ethan to stroke his feathers. "They trust each other," Ethan said. Elias smiled. "Trust is built the same way a lighthouse is. Stone by stone, day by day, without rushing." Captain suddenly spread his wings. With one powerful motion, he lifted into the bright morning sky. He circled the lighthouse once, twice, then glided effortlessly toward the endless ocean. Ethan watched until he became only a tiny white speck against the blue horizon. "He always returns." "Always," Elias answered. "Not because he has to, but because he knows where his light is." Those words stayed with Ethan. How many people spent their lives searching for a place that felt like home? Perhaps home wasn't always a place. Perhaps it was wherever kindness welcomed you back. A deep bell echoed from somewhere inside the lighthouse. Gong, just once. Elias looked upward. That's the morning bell. It means the beacon is ready. Ethan looked toward the lantern room above them. I thought lighthouses worked by themselves. Elias chuckled. Many people believe that. But even the brightest light needs someone willing to care for it. He slowly unlocked a weathered wooden door. Warm sunlight poured through the glass panels above. The great lantern waited silently at the center of the room. Its crystal lenses sparkled like diamonds. Gears turned with quiet precision. The beam of light continued its slow, graceful circle across the sea. Ethan stood in awe. It felt less like a machine and more like a living promise. Elias placed one gentle hand upon the polished brass railing. This lighthouse has guided thousands of ships. He paused, then looked kindly at Ethan. But the people who need it most, he smiled, are often standing on land. Outside, the sea breeze whispered through the open windows. Far beyond the cliffs, a thin ribbon of gray mist began to drift quietly across the water. Elias noticed it first. It seems, he said softly, our first visitor is about to arrive.
Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 3. The gray mist moved slowly across the sea. It wasn't thick. Not yet. But it spread quietly over the water like a soft blanket. Ethan stepped closer to the great glass windows of the lantern room. Only moments ago, he had been able to see the little fishing boat near the horizon. Now, it had completely disappeared. It's gone, he whispered. Elias nodded calmly. No. The boat is still there. We simply can't see it. He gently adjusted one of the polished brass levers beside the great lantern. The beacon continued its steady turn. Its bright white light swept across the growing mist. Round. And round. Never missing a single turn. Ethan watched carefully. Does the light really help when the fog becomes that thick? Elias smiled. It helps more than you might imagine. He walked toward an old wooden cabinet tucked neatly against the stone wall. Inside rested dozens of carefully rolled maps, each one tied with a different colored ribbon. Blue, green, silver, deep red. Elias selected a faded navy blue ribbon. This, he said, carefully unrolling the map across a large oak table, is the oldest sea chart I own. The parchment was worn with age. Tiny handwritten notes filled its edges. Some were so faded they were barely visible. What are these? Ethan asked. Elias ran his finger gently over one small note. They're not directions. They're memories. He smiled. Every captain who returned safely left behind one lesson. Ethan leaned closer. One note read, "Never fight the tide when patience will do." Another said, "Storms always seem endless, until the sky remembers the sun." A third simply read, "Someone believed the light would still be here." Ethan looked at the final sentence for a long time. There was something deeply comforting about it. Someone believed. Sometimes. That was enough. Elias carefully rolled the map closed again. My father began this collection. And his father before him. He placed it back inside the cabinet with great care. The sea remembers every story. We simply choose whether to listen. Just then, a distant sound drifted through the mist. Not the waves. Not the wind. A long, low horn echoed across the water. Boo. Ethan looked toward the window. A ship? Elias nodded. Yes. It has entered the fog. He reached for a polished brass handle connected to a large mechanical horn built into the lighthouse wall. With one smooth motion, he pulled it. The lighthouse answered. Ho. The deep note rolled across the sea. Strong. Steady. Reassuring. Moments later, another horn replied from somewhere beyond the mist. Boo. Ethan smiled. It's answering us. Elias smiled too. No. It's thanking us. The words surprised Ethan. Elias looked toward the hidden ship. Imagine sailing through a world where you can no longer see the sky, or the shore, or even the waves around you. He rested one hand on the brass railing. Then suddenly, you hear a familiar sound. You still don't know exactly where you are, but you know, you're not alone. Silence filled the lantern room. Only the slow turning of the beacon continued. Ethan realized the lighthouse offered more than direction. It offered reassurance, hope, courage. Sometimes people didn't need every answer. Sometimes they only needed a reminder that someone was still keeping the light burning. Captain suddenly swooped past the great windows. His wings flashed white against the gray mist. He circled once before disappearing into the fog. Aren't you worried? Ethan asked. Elias smiled. Captain knows something many people forget. What? He doesn't fly by fear. He flies by trust. The fog continued to thicken outside. The beam of light became even brighter against the pale gray sea. Elias quietly lit the old brass lantern he had carried since morning. Its warm golden flame flickered gently beside the great white beacon. Ethan looked at it curiously. You already have the lighthouse. Why light another lantern? Elias's eyes softened. Because sometimes, the great light guides everyone. He lifted the little lantern. But the small light guides the person standing right beside you. Outside, hidden somewhere within the mist, another lonely horn echoed softly across the sea. Boo. Ethan had a feeling. Before this fog lifted, he was about to learn the lighthouse's greatest lesson. Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 4. The fog grew thicker with every passing minute. From the lantern room, the sea had almost disappeared. Only the steady beam of the lighthouse could still be seen. It swept gracefully through the gray mist. Round. And round. Never slowing. Never wavering. Ethan stood beside the great window, listening. Far away, a ship's horn answered once more. Boo. Then, silence. Only the waves continued their endless rhythm below the cliffs. Whoosh. Whoosh. Ethan looked at Elias. Do you think they're frightened? The old lighthouse keeper smiled gently. Perhaps. But courage doesn't mean feeling no fear. It means continuing to move toward the light even when fear walks beside you. Those words lingered quietly in Ethan's mind. Elias picked up the small brass lantern. Come with me. There is another part of the lighthouse very few visitors ever see. They left the lantern room and began descending a narrow spiral staircase hidden inside the thick stone walls. Each step echoed softly. The air grew cooler. The scent of salt mixed with the smell of old wood and polished brass. At the very bottom of the staircase, Elias unlocked a heavy oak door. Beyond it lay a quiet circular room. Unlike the bright lantern room above, this chamber was warm and softly lit by oil lamps. Shelves lined every wall. Not with tools. Not with maps. But with hundreds of small wooden boxes. Each one carefully labeled. Some looked new. Others had become smooth with age. Ethan walked closer. One box read, Captain Amelia, 1987. Another, The Winter Fisherman, 1999. Another, The Sisters from Blue Harbor, 2014. He looked back at Elias. What are these? The lighthouse keeper smiled. They're letters. Letters. He nodded. From people who found their way home. Elias carefully lifted one small cedar box from a shelf. He opened it with great care. Inside rested dozens of folded letters tied together with blue ribbon. They write to thank the lighthouse? Some do. He smiled softly. But most. They write because they finally found hope again. Ethan looked surprised. Elias unfolded one yellowed letter. Its edges had faded with time. He read only a few lines. I thought the fog would never end. Then I saw your light. That night, I stopped believing I was lost forever. Elias gently folded the letter again. I've received hundreds like this. Some came from sailors. Others. He smiled kindly. Never stepped onto a ship. Ethan understood. The lighthouse wasn't only guiding boats. It was quietly guiding hearts. He noticed another shelf filled with unopened boxes. Why haven't you read those? Elias shook his head. They aren't for me. They belong to whoever becomes the next keeper. You mean, you won't stay here forever? The old man looked toward the ceiling, where the steady rhythm of the great beacon could faintly be heard turning above them. No lighthouse keeper keeps the light forever. We simply care for it. Until someone else is ready. Those words settled gently into the room. Ethan thought about every person he had met during his journey. The river keeper. The old sailor. The windmill builder. Samuel in the cedar forest. Arthur beneath the tree of quiet wishes. Oliver, the clockmaker. Each of them had done the same thing. They hadn't tried to own their wisdom. They had simply passed it on. Just then, a tiny sound echoed from outside the room. Tap. 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 Ethan turned toward the door. Someone was knocking. Elias smiled as though he had expected it. Right on time. He opened the heavy oak door. Standing there was a young girl, no older than 10. She wore a blue raincoat much too large for her. Her curly brown hair peeked out from beneath its hood. In her hands she held a tiny paper boat. She looked up at Elias with uncertain eyes. Excuse me. I think. She hesitated. I've forgotten how to be brave. Ethan looked at the little paper boat she was holding. Its edges were slightly damp from the sea mist. Elias knelt so they were at eye level. He smiled gently. Then you've come to exactly the right place. Outside. The lighthouse beam continued turning through the fog. Patiently. Faithfully. Waiting to remind every lost heart that even the smallest light can begin a journey home. Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 5. The little girl held the damp paper boat carefully in both hands. She looked from Elias to Ethan, then quietly lowered her eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. The gentle crackling of the oil lamps filled the cozy room. Above them, the great lighthouse continued its steady rhythm. Round and round. Its light swept faithfully through the fog. Elias smiled warmly. What is your name? The little girl answered almost in a whisper. Sophie. It's nice to meet you, Sophie. She nodded politely. But she looked at the paper boat. I don't feel very brave today. Elias didn't hurry to answer. Instead, he picked up a small wooden stool and placed it beside him. Would you sit with us? Sophie climbed onto the stool. She held the paper boat close to her chest as though it were something precious. Ethan noticed that one corner of the boat had been carefully repaired with a tiny piece of blue cloth. You fixed it, he said. Sophie nodded. It tore yesterday. I didn't want to throw it away. Elias smiled. Things that have been repaired often become even more special. Sophie looked at him curiously. My grandmother folded this boat for me, she said. Her voice grew softer. Whenever you're afraid, imagine this little boat finding its way home. She looked down again. But Grandma isn't here anymore. And now, I think my boat has forgotten the way. Silence gently settled over the room. Ethan understood that feeling. Sometimes it wasn't the road that seemed lost. It was the heart. Elias reached toward a nearby shelf and carefully picked up a shallow glass bowl filled with clear spring water. He placed it on the wooden table. Then he looked at Sophie. Would you like to try a little experiment? She nodded. Very carefully, she placed her paper boat onto the still water. It floated perfectly. Without sinking. Without drifting. It isn't moving, Sophie whispered. Exactly, Elias replied. He leaned closer. What do you think it's waiting for? She thought for a moment. I don't know. The wind? Elias smiled. Perhaps. He gently blew across the surface of the water. A tiny ripple formed. The paper boat began moving slowly across the bowl. Not quickly. Not perfectly. But steadily. Sophie watched with wide eyes. It found the other side. Elias nodded. Did the boat create the wind? No. Did it know exactly where it would go? She shook her head. It simply trusted the breeze. Sophie watched the little boat floating peacefully. Then Elias said softly, being brave doesn't mean you always know the way. It means trusting that even a gentle breeze can carry you farther than fear ever could. The little girl smiled for the first time. It was small. Almost shy. But it was real. Ethan found himself smiling too. He remembered the tiny white ribbon that had floated beyond the tree of quiet wishes. He remembered the windmill that kept turning because of an invisible wind. Again and again. His journey was reminding him that the things we cannot see often guide us the most. Just then, Captain glided gracefully through the open window. He landed on the stone ledge with a soft flutter of wings. In his beak, he carried a tiny white feather. He hopped toward Sophie. Then gently dropped it beside her paper boat. The feather floated effortlessly on the water, following the same invisible current. Sophie laughed quietly. I think Captain likes my boat. Elias chuckled. I think Captain is reminding us of something. What? He looked kindly at both Ethan and Sophie. The sea doesn't ask whether a feather is heavy. The wind doesn't ask whether a bird is afraid. They simply help each one move forward. He paused. Kindness is much the same. It doesn't ask whether someone deserves hope. It simply offers it. Outside, the fog remained thick. Yet somehow, the room felt brighter than before. Not because the weather had changed, but because one frightened little heart had begun to believe in the light again. Sophie carefully lifted her paper boat from the bowl. This time, she held it with confidence instead of fear. Elias smiled. I think you're ready to visit the shore. Sophie looked toward the window where the waves could barely be seen through the mist. The shore? Elias nodded. There is someone there. Who has been waiting for your boat? Ethan exchanged a curious glance with him. Who could possibly be waiting? For a little paper boat? Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 6. The fog still rested gently upon the sea. Outside the lighthouse, the cliffs had almost disappeared beneath its soft gray blanket. Elias opened the cottage door. A cool breeze welcomed them. It carried the familiar scent of salt, seagrass, and lavender from the little garden. Sophie carefully protected her paper boat beneath her raincoat, as though carrying a tiny treasure. Captain lifted gracefully into the air. He circled above the lighthouse once before gliding toward the shoreline below. Elias smiled. It seems our guide has already gone ahead. The three of them followed the winding stone path that curved down the cliffs. The waves whispered below. Whoosh! 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 Tiny wildflowers grew from the cracks between the rocks. Their bright yellow petals nodded gently in the sea breeze. Although the fog hid the distant horizon, the little path remained easy to follow. Small white seashells had been placed along its edges, one every few steps. Ethan noticed them. Did someone leave these here? Elias nodded. Many years ago. Why? So that travelers could still find the shore, even when they couldn't see it. Ethan smiled. They're like little pieces of the lighthouse. Elias looked pleased. Exactly. Not every light shines. Some simply point the way. They continued walking until they reached a quiet cove hidden between two tall cliffs. The sea here was calm. Gentle waves rolled onto the smooth sand before slipping quietly back into the ocean. Captain was already waiting on a weathered wooden post near the water's edge. He gave a cheerful call. Craw. Sophie looked around. I don't see anyone. Elias knelt beside her. Look closer. She studied the beach carefully. Then she noticed it. Near a cluster of tide pools, an elderly woman sat upon a flat stone. She wore a light blue shawl that moved gently with the wind. In her lap rested a small wicker basket filled with folded paper boats. Some were white. Some were blue. Some carried tiny painted stars. The woman smiled as they approached. I wondered when the morning would bring you. Sophie blinked. You were waiting for me? The woman nodded kindly. I've been waiting for anyone who needed a little more courage. Ethan noticed that every few minutes, she placed one paper boat onto the water. The waves carried it gently out toward the sea. None of them drifted far. The tide always brought them back to the shore. Sophie watched in amazement. They don't sail away. The woman smiled. No. They return. She gently picked up one little boat decorated with a tiny lighthouse. Hope often does. Elias introduced her. This is Grace. She has lived beside this cove longer than I have kept the lighthouse. Grace laughed softly. And he's been keeping that lighthouse for quite a long time. Everyone smiled. Grace looked at Sophie's little paper boat. Would you like to set yours upon the water? Sophie hesitated. What if it sinks? Grace looked toward the calm sea. Then we'll fold another one. What if the waves carry it away? Then perhaps someone else needs its hope. And Sophie whispered, what if it comes back? Grace's eyes sparkled. Then you'll know hope remembered where it belongs. The little girl looked down at her paper boat. She took a deep breath. Then slowly walked to the edge of the water. A tiny wave kissed the sand. She carefully placed the little boat upon it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then another gentle wave lifted the boat. It floated peacefully across the quiet surface. Sophie held her breath. The boat drifted farther than Ethan expected. Captain flew low above it, almost as though escorting its tiny voyage. The sea remained wonderfully calm. Finally, the tide began to turn. Slowly, patiently, the little paper boat drifted back toward the shore. It touched the sand only a few steps away from where Sophie stood. She laughed. A bright, joyful laugh that echoed gently across the cove. It came home. Grace nodded. So did your courage. Ethan watched the little paper boat resting upon the wet sand. It looked exactly the same. Yet somehow, it felt transformed. Not because it had crossed a great distance, but because someone had trusted it enough to let it go. Elias looked toward the sea. The ocean has many lessons. He smiled at Ethan. But the next one. He glanced toward the growing mist beyond the cove. Usually arrives when the tide changes. Far beyond the rocks. A lonely bell buoy began to ring through the fog. Dong. 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 Its steady voice echoed across the water, as if calling someone safely home. Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 7. The sound of the bell buoy drifted across the mist. Dong. 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 Each gentle note lingered over the quiet sea before fading into the breeze. Sophie picked up her little paper boat and held it close. She no longer clutched it out of fear. She carried it with quiet confidence. Grace smiled as she watched. You see? The sea didn't promise your boat an easy journey. It simply gave it a chance to return. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. I think I'm not as afraid anymore. Elias smiled. That is how courage usually arrives. Quietly. Without announcing itself. Captain glided down from the sky and landed beside the bell buoy, balancing effortlessly as it rose and fell with the gentle waves. He seemed perfectly at home. Ethan watched him in admiration. He never seems worried. Grace chuckled softly. Oh, Captain has known storms. Many storms. She looked toward the endless sea. But he learned long ago that fighting every wave only leaves you tired. Sometimes, the wisest thing you can do is trust the wind and keep your wings open. Ethan remembered the windmill from his journey. It had taught him almost the same lesson. The world, he realized, had a beautiful way of repeating important truths until the heart finally understood them. As they walked slowly along the shoreline, Ethan noticed something unusual scattered across the sand. Tiny pieces of smooth blue glass. They sparkled like little sapphires beneath the sunlight. What are these? He asked. Grace bent down and picked one up. Sea glass. She placed the small piece into Ethan's palm. Its edges were perfectly smooth. It began as an ordinary bottle many years ago. The sea carried it. The waves shaped it. And time softened every sharp edge. Ethan turned the little piece of glass in the sunlight. It glowed with a quiet beauty. Grace smiled. Life often does the same. We all begin with rough edges. But kindness, patience, and time, they polish us. Sophie found a tiny green piece nearby. She held it up excitedly. This one is beautiful. Grace nodded. And once, it may have been something someone thought was broken. Ethan slipped the blue sea glass carefully into his backpack beside the river stone, the seashell, the cedar bookmark, the bronze key of quiet hearts, the morning bell, the compass of kindness, and the other treasured keepsakes. Another lesson. Small enough to fit into his pocket. Large enough to remain in his heart forever. The four of them continued walking until they reached the end of the quiet cove. There stood an old wooden bench facing the open sea. Its backrest carried a weathered carving. Ethan brushed away a little sand and read the faded words aloud. No one finds the shore by staring at the storm. He read it again. Slower this time. Elias smiled. A sailor carved those words nearly 30 years ago. He had survived the worst storm of his life. What happened to him? Ethan asked. The old lighthouse keeper looked toward the horizon. He returned every spring. He never came to thank the lighthouse. He came to encourage those who still feared the sea. Grace nodded gently. He used to sit on this very bench. And whenever someone said, "I'm afraid," he would answer, "Good." Sophie looked surprised. Why would he say that? Grace smiled warmly. Because fear reminds us that something matters. Courage is simply choosing not to let fear make every decision. The little girl looked out across the calm ocean. She took a slow breath, then smiled. I think I understand. Just then, a tiny movement near the rocks caught Ethan's attention. A small sea turtle struggled among a patch of tangled fishing rope left behind by the tide. Its little flippers moved desperately, but it couldn't free itself. Without hesitation, Sophie ran toward it. Oh no. It's trapped. Elias and Ethan quickly followed. The turtle looked frightened. Its dark eyes searched every face around it. Elias knelt carefully. Easy, little one. We're here. He looked at Ethan. Would you hand me my pocket knife? Ethan reached into Elias's satchel and passed him the small folding knife. Very gently, Elias began cutting the old rope away. The tiny turtle remained perfectly still, almost as though it understood help had finally arrived. The waves whispered softly around them. Captain watched silently from a nearby rock. After a few careful moments, the final strand fell away. The little turtle was free. It didn't rush into the sea. Instead, it paused, looked back at the four smiling faces, and then slowly disappeared beneath the sparkling waves. Sophie clapped happily. We helped it find its way home. Elias smiled. Sometimes. He looked at Ethan. The greatest light we can offer is simply helping someone take their next step. The gentle words settled into Ethan's heart. Somewhere beyond the mist, the lighthouse beacon continued turning. Patiently, faithfully, ready for the next soul searching for a way forward. Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 8. The little sea turtle disappeared beneath the clear blue water. For a brief moment, its tiny shell could still be seen beneath the gentle waves. Then, it was gone. Sophie stood quietly at the edge of the shore. She smiled. I hope it has a wonderful life. Elias looked out across the sea. I believe it will. Not because the ocean will always be calm, but because it has already learned something important. Ethan looked toward him. What is that? The old lighthouse keeper smiled. That there are kind hearts in the world. A peaceful silence followed. The waves continued their familiar rhythm. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Grace gently gathered the empty pieces of fishing rope they had cut away. She folded them carefully into a small cloth bag. Ethan looked surprised. You're keeping them? Grace nodded. We always do. So they don't trap another traveler. She looked toward the sea. Sometimes kindness isn't only helping someone. It's making sure the next person doesn't face the same problem. Those words reminded Ethan of the tiny seashell markers along the cliff path. Someone had placed them there long ago. For people they would probably never meet. Perhaps that was one of the purest forms of kindness. Helping someone whose name you might never know. Captain suddenly flew overhead. He circled twice before landing on the weathered wooden bench. His sharp eyes remained fixed on the horizon. Elias noticed immediately. He's seen something. Ethan followed Captain's gaze. Far beyond the fading mist, a tiny shape slowly appeared. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow. Then sunlight broke through the clouds. The shape became clearer. A small wooden sailboat. Its white sail fluttered weakly in the breeze. It looks damaged, Ethan said quietly. Elias nodded. The storm 2 nights ago must have carried it farther than expected. The boat drifted slowly toward the cliffs. Not dangerously, but uncertainly. The lighthouse keeper remained calm. He lifted the brass lantern he always carried, even though it was broad daylight. Sophie looked puzzled. Why bring a lantern when the sun is shining? Elias smiled. This lantern isn't for lighting the sea. It's for welcoming whoever reaches the shore. Grace nodded gently. People who have been through difficult journeys often need warmth before they need answers. Those words settled deeply within Ethan. He remembered every place he had visited. The river had welcomed him. The sailor had welcomed him. The windmill builder. Samuel. Arthur. Oliver. None of them had begun by teaching. They had begun by welcoming. Perhaps that was the first lesson every wise person understood. The little sailboat came closer. A man stood alone at its helm. His clothes were damp. His face looked tired. Yet when the lighthouse beam swept gently across the water, he straightened. His shoulders relaxed. And for the first time, he smiled. "He sees the lighthouse," Sophie whispered. Elias nodded. "No. He sees hope." The old keeper quietly lit the small brass lantern. Its golden flame flickered gently despite the sea breeze. Ethan looked at the tiny light. Compared to the great beacon above the lighthouse, it seemed almost insignificant. Yet somehow, it felt just as comforting. Grace noticed him watching. "My father used to tell me, a lighthouse shows people where the shore is. A lantern reminds them someone is waiting when they arrive." Ethan smiled. He thought of all the treasures resting inside his backpack. Each one a little lantern, a small reminder of hope. The sailboat drifted steadily into the quiet cove. The man lowered his sail. He stepped carefully onto the shore. For a few moments, he simply stood there, breathing deeply, as though grateful to feel solid ground beneath his feet again. Then his eyes met Elias's. The old lighthouse keeper didn't ask where he had come from. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply stepped forward, holding the warm lantern between them, and said with a gentle smile, "Welcome." The weary sailor closed his eyes for just a moment. Then he quietly answered, "I was beginning to think no one would be here." Elias's smile grew even warmer. "We always keep a light burning." Behind them, high upon the cliffs, the lighthouse continued its patient circle, its bright beam reaching far beyond the sea, searching for the next heart, still waiting to find its way home.
Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 9. The weary sailor stood quietly on the shore. His boots were wet from the sea. His hands trembled slightly as he tied the small sailboat to an old wooden post. For a long moment, he simply watched the lighthouse. Its great beacon continued its slow, faithful circle above the cliffs, round and round, never asking who needed its light, only offering it. Elias stepped forward with the warm brass lantern still glowing in his hands. "Come, the kettle is always warm." The sailor looked surprised. "You don't even know my name." Elias smiled. "I don't need to. Everyone deserves a warm cup of tea after a difficult journey." The man laughed quietly. It was the first real laugh Ethan had heard from him. "My name is Thomas. It's good to meet you." Sophie smiled brightly. "I'm Sophie. This is Ethan. And that's Grace." Captain gave a cheerful call from the weathered fence post. Proud, Thomas looked at the seabird and smiled. "I think he approves of me." "He usually does," Elias replied with a grin. "Captain is an excellent judge of kind hearts." Together they climbed the winding path back toward the lighthouse cottage. The mist had begun to lift. Patches of bright blue sky appeared above the sea. Sunlight shimmered across the waves like scattered silver. Inside the cozy cottage, the fireplace crackled softly. The scent of fresh bread and chamomile tea filled the room. Grace placed a loaf of warm bread on the wooden table. Sophie carefully arranged 5 little cups. Ethan helped Elias light another candle. No one hurried. No one spoke loudly. Everything felt peaceful, as though the cottage itself understood that tired hearts healed best in quiet places. Thomas wrapped both hands around the warm teacup. He closed his eyes. I haven't felt this safe in a long time. No one interrupted him. Sometimes silence was the greatest kindness. After a few moments, he opened his eyes again. I lost my way 3 nights ago. A sudden storm covered the sea. I couldn't see the stars. I couldn't see the shore. I thought. His voice became softer. I thought I would never find home again. Elias listened carefully, then asked only one question. What kept you going? Thomas smiled faintly. I remembered something my mother used to say. He looked toward the lighthouse window. If you cannot see the light, keep sailing until the light can see you. The room became wonderfully still. Even the fire seemed to pause. Ethan quietly repeated the words in his heart. Keep sailing until the light can see you. How many people gave up? Only moments before hope found them. Elias reached toward a nearby shelf and picked up a small wooden model of the lighthouse. It was beautifully carved by hand. Every tiny window, every stone, every railing had been carefully shaped. He placed it gently before Thomas. My father made this. He gave one to every sailor who visited. Thomas looked at it with quiet wonder. It's beautiful. Elias nodded. But there's something special inside. He carefully lifted the tiny roof. Hidden within the little lighthouse rested a miniature candle, no larger than Ethan's thumb. Thomas smiled. A light inside the light. Exactly, Elias said. My father believed. Every person carries a lighthouse within them. Sometimes the flame burns brightly. Sometimes it becomes very small, but it is never truly extinguished. Ethan thought about every lesson his journey had given him. The river had taught him to let go. The sea had taught him to trust. The windmill had taught him that small kindness could travel far. The cedar forest had taught him to listen. The tree of quiet wishes had taught him to hope. The clockmaker had taught him to measure life by smiles. And now, the lighthouse was teaching him something even deeper. That hope was not only something we searched for, it was something we could become. Outside, Captain suddenly spread his wings and flew toward the lighthouse tower. A moment later, the great beacon completed another slow turn. Its brilliant light swept peacefully across the sea. Thomas watched it through the window, then smiled. I don't think the lighthouse rescued me. Elias looked at him kindly. No, Thomas shook his head. It reminded me that I still wanted to be found. The old keeper's eyes sparkled with quiet understanding. That, he said softly, is when every journey home truly begins. Outside, the afternoon sun broke completely through the last of the fog. The sea stretched clear and bright to the horizon once more. But Ethan had a feeling. The greatest lesson of the lighthouse was still waiting. Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 10. By late afternoon, the sea had become wonderfully calm. The fog had completely disappeared. Sunlight shimmered across the water like thousands of tiny stars. From the lighthouse balcony, Ethan could see fishing boats returning to the harbor. White sails caught the gentle breeze. Seagulls glided effortlessly overhead. Captain circled once above the cliffs before landing beside the great lantern. He seemed pleased that the sea had found its smile again. Elias stood quietly beside Ethan. People often believe my work ends when the storm passes. He smiled, but that is usually when it truly begins. Ethan looked at him curiously. What do you mean? The old keeper pointed toward the boats sailing home. When someone survives a storm, they don't only need dry clothes. They need someone to remind them that life is still beautiful. Those words stayed with Ethan. He thought of Thomas downstairs, laughing softly with Grace and Sophie over warm bread and tea. The storm had ended, but healing was only beginning. Just then, Sophie hurried up the spiral staircase, carrying a small wooden basket. Inside were tiny folded pieces of paper, each one tied with a thin blue string. Elias, she said excitedly. It's almost sunset. The old keeper smiled. Then it's time. Ethan looked at the basket. Time for what? For the evening messages. He picked up one of the folded notes and handed it to Ethan. Open it. Ethan untied the blue string. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. May today leave your heart lighter than yesterday. He smiled. Another note read, someone is grateful that you are still here. Another, hope grows quietly, just like the tide. Ethan looked at the basket in amazement. Who writes these? Elias chuckled. Everyone. Sailors. Visitors. Children. Neighbors. Sometimes even strangers. Grace appeared in the doorway carrying another basket. This one was filled with smooth white shells. Each shell held one folded message. What happens to them? Ethan asked. Grace smiled. We leave them along the shore, so that whoever walks there tomorrow finds a little unexpected hope. Sophie lifted one shell carefully. My favorite place is near the old driftwood tree. Children always find them first. Ethan couldn't help smiling. He remembered the seashells marking the cliff path. Here too, someone had quietly chosen kindness without expecting anything in return. As the golden sun slowly descended toward the horizon, the five of them walked together along the beach. The waves glowed with warm shades of gold and orange. Captain flew overhead like a silent guardian. Every few steps, they gently placed another shell upon the sand, one beside a weathered rock, one beneath the driftwood tree, one near a patch of sea lavender, one beside the old wooden bench. Each shell carried a message, not signed, not addressed, simply waiting for the right person to discover it. Thomas paused as he placed his shell near the water's edge. What should mine say? Elias smiled. Write the words you once needed to hear. Thomas thought quietly. Then he wrote, even if today feels endless, tomorrow still knows your name. He folded the note carefully and tucked it inside the shell. Ethan felt something stir deep within his heart. Perhaps every lesson he had received along this journey had been someone's evening message, left quietly, years before he ever arrived. The sun slipped lower. The sky slowly transformed into soft shades of amber, rose, and violet. The lighthouse beacon became brighter with every passing minute. Its warm white light stretched farther across the growing twilight. Sophie pointed toward the horizon. The first star. Everyone looked up. A tiny silver star had appeared above the sea. Grace smiled gently. My grandmother always said, the first star doesn't end the day. It reminds us that light and darkness can share the same sky. Silence settled peacefully around them. No one wished to disturb such a beautiful evening. The sea breathed softly. The lighthouse shone faithfully. And somewhere, hidden among the shells resting upon the shore, tomorrow's hope was already waiting for someone who didn't yet know they needed it. Ethan had a feeling. The lighthouse's brightest light was never the one at the top of the tower. It was the quiet kindness people left behind for one another. Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 11. Evening settled gently over the coastline. The last rays of sunlight slipped beneath the horizon, leaving behind a sky painted in deep shades of violet, silver, and blue. One by one, the stars began to appear. Above the cliffs, the lighthouse awakened to the night. Its great beacon shone brighter than ever. The enormous crystal lens turned slowly. Its warm light swept across the sea. Round, pause, round, pause. Far below, the waves reflected the light like liquid silver. Ethan stood on the balcony beside Elias. Neither of them spoke. Some moments, Ethan had learned, became more meaningful when words were allowed to rest. After a while, Elias quietly broke the silence. "Would you like to help me tonight?" Ethan turned with a smile. "I'd be honored." The old lighthouse keeper led him inside the lantern room. The giant Fresnel lens glowed softly as it revolved with perfect rhythm. Every polished glass panel scattered tiny rainbows across the stone walls. Elias opened a weathered wooden chest resting beneath the lantern. Inside were soft cloths, bottles of clear oil, tiny brass tools, and a worn leather notebook. He handed Ethan one of the clean cloths. The light can only shine clearly if someone remembers to care for it. Together, they began polishing the great crystal panels. Slowly, carefully, not because they looked dirty, but because even the smallest layer of salt carried by the sea breeze could soften the light. Ethan worked quietly, each movement reflected in the crystal until it seemed as though hundreds of Ethans were caring for the beacon together. After several peaceful minutes, he asked, "Have you ever missed a night?" Elias paused. He looked thoughtfully toward the sea. "Only once." Ethan looked surprised. "What happened?" The old keeper smiled gently. "It was many years ago. I became very ill. I believed I could still do the work. But by sunset, I no longer had the strength to climb the tower." Ethan listened carefully. "So what did you do?" "I worried." He laughed softly. "I worried far more than I prayed." Then his smile grew warmer. But just before darkness fell, there was a knock at my door. Ethan waited. It was a fisherman. He had noticed that the lighthouse hadn't yet begun to shine, so he climbed the tower himself. He lit the beacon, and then quietly went home. The room became wonderfully still. Elias rested one hand upon the polished brass railing. He never asked for thanks. He simply saw that someone needed help. Ethan thought of the sea turtle, the paper boat, the shells filled with encouraging messages, the kindness scattered along every step of his journey. Perhaps the world stayed bright because ordinary people quietly kept one another's lights burning. Elias opened the worn leather notebook. Unlike Oliver's notebook of smiles, this one contained only names. Hundreds of them. Some pages had faded with age. Others looked newly written. "What is this?" Ethan asked. "The Book of Keepers. Everyone who has ever helped protect this lighthouse." Ethan slowly turned a page. There were lighthouse keepers, fishermen, carpenters, sailmakers, gardeners, children, even travelers. Each name had a tiny date beside it. Some had cared for the lighthouse for decades. Others, for only one evening. Ethan smiled. So every helper becomes a keeper. Elias nodded. Keeping the light isn't a job. It's a choice. Just then, a gentle knock echoed from below. Tap, tap, tap. Captain fluttered onto the windowsill. He gave one cheerful call. Crow. Elias smiled knowingly. Our evening visitors have arrived. They descended the spiral staircase together. Outside the cottage stood 3 fishermen returning from the sea. Their baskets were full of fresh fish. One of them carried a basket of warm bread. Another held a bouquet of white daisies. The oldest fisherman smiled as he saw Elias. We thought you might enjoy some supper. Elias laughed. And I was just wondering what I should cook. The men placed the gifts upon the wooden table outside the cottage. No money changed hands. No one counted who had given more. It simply felt natural. One fisherman looked toward the lighthouse. My father always said, "We don't repay the lighthouse. We repay the kindness that keeps it shining." Ethan looked around at the smiling faces gathered beneath the evening stars. The beacon above continued its patient circle. Its light reached far across the sea. Yet here, around one simple wooden table, another kind of light was quietly glowing. The light of generosity. The light of friendship. The light that appeared whenever people cared for one another without expecting anything in return. And Ethan realized, perhaps every lighthouse had 2 beacons, one that guided ships, and another, invisible to the eye, that guided hearts. Episode 10, The Lighthouse That Guided Lost Hearts. Part 12. Night settled peacefully over the coastline. The stars stretched across the sky like countless tiny lanterns. Far below, the sea reflected their gentle glow. The lighthouse beacon continued its faithful journey through the darkness. Round, round, round. Its light swept across the waves with quiet certainty. After supper, the fishermen thanked Elias and began walking back toward the harbor. Thomas helped carry the empty baskets to the gate. Sophie waved until they disappeared beyond the moonlit path. Grace smiled. They'll be back before sunrise. They always are. Ethan looked at her. They visit every day? She nodded. Not because they have to, because kindness becomes a habit when it's practiced long enough. Those simple words stayed with Ethan. Perhaps the greatest traditions were not grand celebrations. They were small acts of goodness repeated every day. A cool sea breeze drifted through the lavender garden. The little sea glass wind chimes beside the blue door sang softly. Chime, chime, chime. Elias picked up the brass lantern once more. Come, there's one place you've not yet seen. Together, they followed a narrow stone path behind the lighthouse. It curved around the cliff until it reached a quiet hill overlooking the ocean. At its center stood a single ancient bench carved from weathered cedar. Beside it grew a lone white rose bush. Every bloom faced the sea. There were no fences, no statues, only the bench, the flowers, and the endless horizon. It's beautiful, Ethan whispered. Elias nodded. This is the garden of returning light. Ethan looked around. It feels different. It is. The old keeper gently rested the lantern on the ground. For many years, when sailors returned safely after difficult journeys, they planted a white rose here. Grace smiled softly. Each flower is someone's thank you. Sophie carefully counted the blooming roses. There are so many. There are, Elias said. And every spring, more appear. Ethan walked slowly among the blossoms. The fragrance was delicate, peaceful. Each flower looked almost identical. Yet he knew, every one carried a different story. He noticed a small wooden plaque beneath the oldest rose bush. Its faded inscription read, "For those who found the shore, and for those who became the shore for someone else." Ethan read the words twice, then a third time. Something about them touched him deeply. Elias stepped beside him. "Do you understand?" Ethan thought quietly. "I think so. Finding hope is a wonderful gift." He looked toward the lighthouse. But helping someone else find hope may be an even greater one. The old keeper's eyes sparkled. "My father used to say the very same thing." Captain landed gently upon the wooden bench. He folded his wings and looked peacefully toward the moonlit sea, almost as though he, too, was remembering old stories. Sophie reached into her pocket. She carefully unfolded a tiny piece of paper. On it she had drawn her little paper boat floating beside the lighthouse. She smiled shyly. "I'd like to leave this here." Grace nodded warmly. "I think the garden would like that." Together they tucked the drawing beneath a smooth white stone beside one of the rose bushes. The wind lifted its corner ever so slightly. Then it became still again. Ethan smiled. Another quiet reminder. Another gentle message left behind for tomorrow. As they turned to leave, the lighthouse beams swept gracefully across the garden. For a brief moment, every white rose glowed like silver beneath the moonlight. The entire hillside shimmered. It looked less like flowers, and more like hundreds of tiny stars blooming upon the earth. Ethan stood silently. He had never seen anything so peaceful. Elias looked toward the horizon. People often believe a lighthouse saves ships. He smiled gently, but sometimes he looked at the glowing roses. The people who have been guided become lights for others. Far out at sea, another ship appeared beneath the stars. Its lantern flickered softly. The lighthouse answered with its steady beam. Light calling to light, hope answering hope. Ethan quietly placed one hand over his heart. He had a feeling, before he left this place, he would receive one final gift. Not something to carry in his backpack, but something to carry for the rest of his life.